everyone, and welcome to another episode of GDDV 501, Lighting and Rendering. My name is Colossus. Alright guys, we are moving along pretty darn well. This video is going to take us to what would be normally the end of week 1. So, today, we're going to talk a little bit about terminology and a few considerations that you're going to need moving forward within this particular course. Okay, everyone, so let's get started. So, terminology and considerations. Within video games, we don't have the same opportunity that we have within film. We don't have the same opportunity. It's an interactive medium, which means that everything that our player sees and does is going to affect their understanding of the world that we've created for them. And the world that we created for them is going to tell a story. There is narrative, regardless of whether or not you are intentionally adding narrative to your game. It's automatically there based on what the player sees and does within the game. Everything they do and see within your game is going to suggest something about that world. And if you haven't particularly added a narrative to your game, then your player is going to make one up in their own head based on what they see through visual storytelling, through environmental storytelling, I should say, or through the mechanics that you've set up your player to have. All of these things say something about your world, and that is narrative. Within games themselves, we rely on cameras, just like you do within a traditional sense, like within a film. We rely on our cameras, but our cameras are different. We may have dynamic cameras, we may have procedural cameras of some kind. So dynamic cameras where the player can automatically take control of it, or procedural cameras where there's some type of artificial intelligence kind of like moving your camera for you, or that's, procedurally moved about the scene. Or you might even have pre-rendered videos, which kind of moves into that, traditional narrative style where everything is pre-rendered and they don't really have a choice in what they're seeing. But background actors and cutscenes and interactive dialogue and voiceovers, all of these things are automatically integrated into your game. Anything that you've got integrated in your game like this is involved in our storytelling, and it tells the story of the world that you've created for your particular player. I believe that your camera is one of the very first things that you should understand when you are creating your game. Understanding what your player can see at any given time within your game is of extreme importance. Understand your camera, your game camera, as soon as you possibly can, right? Because that is how your player is going to interact with your game. That is where your player is going to get all of their information. So it's extremely important that one of the first things you do whenever you're starting to create your game is understand precisely the type of game camera you've got. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some different terms that you might come across within this particular series, or just within your working out there. Mise en scène. So mise en scène is a French term that basically means placing things on stage or placing on the stage, and it's about everything that you see in the frame. Everything you see in the frame, all of your actors, all your lighting, all your decor, your props, your costumes, everything that your player can see within your game is mise en scène. Even the framing of your shot and the use of the camera is also considered, as far as a film is concerned, is also considered mise en scène. And it is as far as we're concerned too, right? As far as game is concerned, it's all about that. So it's every single thing that is placed in front of the camera, every single thing that is revealed by your camera. Now, in video games, we have a couple of issues here. It's not a passive medium, so the player can look around and see different things. But we also present them with things like our HUD and our GUI. And all of that is mise en scène as well, right? All of that is just as important. We are presenting a story even through our HUD and GUI. Our HUD/GUI. We are presenting a story through that as well. Like everything the player sees in the scene. So we really have to be aware whenever we create our levels, whenever we create our camera, whenever we create our camera mechanics, of exactly what we're showing our player. Incorrect, or if we don't give this careful consideration when creating our camera, if we've given our player particular mechanics where they can control the camera, they can easily add to the original mise en scène, or what we intended to be the mise en scène. If they have complete control over their camera and they can look wherever they want, this can have a negative effect on immersion if we haven't taken it into consideration. The same is true through level design. If we haven't taken into consideration our levels and our players are able to get to particular areas that we weren't expecting them to be able to get to, again, this can have have a negative effect on immersion. In fact, it's going to take them out of the game and put them into a spot where, the game doesn't exist really outside of our game. They've moved outside of our system in our thoughts anyway. They moved outside of our particular system, and they're going to stop playing the game. They're going to start watching the production, start seeing the production instead of actually playing your game. And that's not what we want. In order to remain immersed, we have to make sure that we understand everything about our levels and everything about what we're able to reveal to our particular player. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a traditional film director. I had a conversation with him a little while ago, and I had just started playing around with the 360 cameras. And I really thought they were fun, and I didn't understand why we couldn't make traditional film into an interactive experience where we filmed everything in 360, utilizing these 360 cameras and allowing our viewers to participate in our film by control of the camera, by controlling on exactly what they see. And this director, and I thought this was very forward thinking of me. But this director didn't agree with me. In fact, this director suggested that it would add immense cost to the film, because unlike a virtual space where we can simply add in more level, in a traditional film, they set up their shots very particularly, right? They have it set up so this is what they're showing at any given time. The composition of their shots are extremely important to them. They don't have to worry about what's happening behind. All they have to do is make sure that what's in the camera looks good. Sorry, there's a lot of noise going on here today. They have to make sure that they have to make sure that the shot that they've got set up looks good and nothing else. They don't have to worry about what's happening behind. They don't have to worry about a director's chair and all the camera crew and everything like that. But if suddenly we gave the audience control over a 360 camera and the audience was able to turn around and look and see what's behind them, again, this would have an extremely negative effect on the immersion levels within that film in the same way, because it would reveal all the behind the scenes stuff, just like moving outside of a level within our game would. So even though I think it's still a great idea having control over my own camera when I'm watching a film, there's got to be some way we could do it, right? Anyway, I'm going to leave it for you film guys. So let's take a look at an amazing example of mise-en-scène and how the player themselves can change the original mise-en-scène to include other elements that maybe the designers weren't originally expecting them to be able to do. Let's take a look at the character reveal within the game Portals. So this is an example of the player using mechanics to add to the original mise-en-scène. In Portal, we play a faceless character. We have a faceless avatar, and we're able to project ourselves our personality onto this particular character. We can pretend it's us. That's one of the benefits of having this type of camera, right? This first-person camera, is that we can kind of project ourselves onto this and pretend that we are doing it. It adds to the fantasy, the aesthetic fantasy of our particular game. But in this case, utilizing the mechanics that were offered, this is not me, this player was able to create a double portal and thus reveal their character. So let's take a look here. And this is a great example of player mechanics allowing the player to add to the original mise-en-scène. We're no longer a faceless avatar. We are now this particular character, right? We're now this particular character. All right, guys, that's a great example. And this can happen. You have to be aware of the mechanics you offer your player and how they're going to interact with your particular game. The next idea I want to take a look at is the idea of diegetic and non-diegetic sound and diegetic and non-diegetic visuals. So a diegetic sound is any sound whose source can be found within the frame or within the world that exists within this frame. Right? It's things like characters' voices, sounds made by objects in the real world or in that world that we've created. A non-diegetic sound is any sound that is created by a source outside of our story space. So things like commentary or mood music. Any of this kind of stuff can be non-diegetic sound, right? So diegetic sound is anything that's within the world that we've created, and non-diegetic is things that are outside of the story space that we've created. Now, in exactly the same way, within video games, in exactly the same way that there are diegetic and non-diegetic sound, and I guess there are to some degree, there can be as well within traditional film, but within video games, there are diegetic and non-diegetic visuals. Within a video game, in exactly the same way, a diegetic visual is anything that is in the world space that we've created. So if we've got a world in there and that thing has a meaning within that world, it's included within that world, that is a diegetic visual if the player's seeing it. So anything that, a character that you might see or whatever, anything you might see that exists within that world. A non-diegetic visual is something that's outside of the world. The player is still seeing it, but exists outside of that world space. So in the case of film, it might be things like titles and title screens and credits and that kind of thing. But when we talk about diegetic visuals within video games, it could be very well are things like our HUD as well, right? We've got these representation of images that give our player information that are an important part of our game, but they don't actually exist in that world. They're there strictly to give our player information. So, is the information that the player is given, for example, the amount of oxygen left in your spacesuit, a diegetic or non-diegetic visual? And if you're right now you're thinking like, well, it's in the HUD, so therefore it must be non-diegetic. Yes, that could be the proper answer, but it absolutely could be diegetic as well. If we've built ourselves a game in which we play an astronaut who is going on a spacewalk and we have to watch the amount of oxygen we have in our suit, well, there are several ways we can present this information to our player. We can present it as a simple health bar or some kind of bar at the top of our screen that our player can then watch it go up and down as we fill and remove oxygen from our particular suit. However, and that would be a non-diegetic visual that's associated with our game. However, if we have added in a monitor on our character's wrist, and every time you press the particular button, our character lifts their wrist and they look at their wrist monitor, and we see the monitor integrated directly into the spacesuit, well, that becomes a diegetic visual. So when creating your game, it's important to understand whether or not we want to include our information as a diegetic or non-diegetic asset. There's a very different feeling in the two, right? One is meant to be part of the world, and one is strictly there to be informational. So let's go on to talk a little bit about camera. And I really want to talk about two kinds of cameras here and what these can do. There is the gameplay camera, the camera that the player utilizes to keep track of their character within the game. It needs to be functional. It needs to give a player the view of the things that we want them to view in gameplay. Then there is the cutscene style camera. The cutscene style camera is more of a traditional camera that allows us to produce pre-rendered narrative points, as an example. And this type of camera, this divide between gameplay and narrative can often cause a problem, right? It can cause a disconnect within the player. It can cause a loss of immersion within the player. As the player moves from gameplay into a cutscene, they stop whatever they're doing and kind of register what's just occurred. And it might take them a moment to understand that they've kind of lost control of their character, as an example. Additionally, the cutscene itself can cause a loss of immersion when the player is suddenly seeing things that they can do within the cutscene and they can't naturally do within the game, right? There's this divide that occurs, that everything's divided in half. We're either in game or we are in the cutscene. And if we're not taking a look at things like environmental storytelling and that sort of thing, if we're taking a look at just the pure narrative where the dialogue is produced, then the game is often looked at as filler between narrative points, and that's not what we want at all, right? We kind of like this. We want to make sure that the player remains immersed and that everything they do it seems like it has consequence within the game. A lot of games now are trying to lessen the divide by allowing for a seamless transition or some type of transition that allows the player to understand that they're moving from one point to the other. They're moving from control to a loss of control. Having these visual transitions can really aid in maintaining our player's immersion. They are ready for what's going to occur as they switch over into this new scene. Their mind doesn't have to suddenly switch gears, right? They've allowed this transition to occur. Additionally, there is things that are being done in a lot of games now where the player maintains control of their character across a cutscene, right? Where they might have complete control, where it's their responsibility to continue framing this cutscene where the dialogue's being delivered. Or there's kind of this hybrid mode where the player has some control over their player, but the camera is kind of locked onto the narrative point that's occurring at that particular time, so they can receive that dialogue and they can receive that information that they're supposed to receive during the game. This is an older example, but let's take a look at one of the in Assassin's Creed, one of the assassinations that occurs. So this is some pretty low-res video here. Again, this is not my recording. This is someone else's gameplay that I found. And what's really interesting here, we're going to see a couple of things. We're going to see the limited control that a player has during a cutscene. So the information is being produced, and the player still has some control of the character. I'll just turn on So we can see. So right now the cutscene is happening. There's a conversation going on between two people back there in the background, and the player still has some control over the character. You can see they can move their camera around, but they can't have the main story point leave screen. The player himself can still move around. Now something important is going to happen right here. We're going to see a transition where we go from player control, so even this limited control, to no control, where a very important point is delivered. Watch, we'll see the transition occur. And there, now there's a transition where this visual transition occurred, where we moved into this particular point, a close-up of this, where the important information is being delivered, and eventually we're going to transition back into our player control. So this type of thing is what we're used to. We're used to seeing these fast cuts and these transitions that occur across films, right? Where we shift our view from one location to the other. And if it's done properly, within a film, it's not even noticeable. You don't even realize that the camera has changed. And we're going to talk about the idea of transitions a little bit later on. So that's Assassin's Creed, an older version, an older Assassin's Creed, yes. But in this, they were doing a great job even back then of kind of maintaining that narrative look. So we understand that we're getting these narrative points. Our player still has some control over their character, and they utilize visual transitions in order to allow us to transition into or cut into a close-up to deliver the important information. Let's talk a little bit about dynamic cameras. Procedural cameras or dynamic cameras or player control cameras all offer the player a unique look at the world. And they're supposed to do so without interrupting gameplay. And it's often the case, right? These cameras will shift and you won't even know they're doing it. A lot of times you won't even understand that it's happened if it's been done properly. These cameras are meant to deal with the changing environment, to give us a better view of what's occurring, to give us the information that they want us to have. Oftentimes, these cameras will utilize cinematography theory in order to give the player a better view, in order to create a particular mood or feeling within the player whenever they utilize these particular dynamic cameras. There's a couple of great examples on here, and some of these are older again. So in Gears of War, as an example, when we talk about the idea of an aimed shot, the camera in Gears of War changes from this wide field of view into this more narrow field of view, into like a longer lens. And all the action kind of shifts closer to the character. So if they were aiming at someone, they kind of shift in closer to that character. And we kind of get this zoomed in look. And this makes us feel a sense of urgency as we look through this thing. We're really experiencing what it's like to look through a scope. Any game at all that has kind of this scoped in view, that's a dynamic camera. We're changing our player camera to something more narrow to allow the player an in-close look at what they're supposed to be shooting, as an example. Another great example from Gears of War is the roadie run. And again, in this particular case, our field of view narrows a lot. As our character starts to run, the field of view narrows a lot, and so we kind of zoom in on the character in third person. We zoom in on the character, and now the camera shakes. It's no longer this nice steady cam. The camera shakes, and it feels like we're really running. And the entire point of this is to generate a feeling of speed or urgency within the player's action, right? They start to run, and they feel like they're running. And that's really important. That's what we want to do as cinematographers. We want to create a unique feeling. We want to make our player feel something, right? We want that emotion that's involved. Same with Assassin's Creed. In Assassin's Creed, The Leap of Faith, when that Leap of Faith first came out, the first time we were introduced in Assassin's Creed: The Leap of Faith, it really, in many people, it caused a huge sense of vertigo. It made us feel that we were actually jumping. So if you were one of those people, having that jump occur was very, very strange for us, right? It caused a sense of vertigo, like I said. And basically all it was a reframing of the lens. So we had this longer lens when we were jumping. That's all it did, a longer following lens as we leapt across the screen. Let's take a quick look at the Leap of Faith in Assassin's Creed. Okay, we've got some real low-res footage here again, and this is not my recording. This is something that I found, but it really demonstrates this point really well. Let's take a look here as we climb up this tower. Right now, our camera is low. Our camera is in the typical third-person camera, what we're expecting here, kind of at shoulder height. We have a really good view all around us as far as what's happening in front of us is concerned. However, our character is going to be moving up this tower. What's going to happen is the camera is going to shift procedurally down below the player so that we can see upwards. Let's take a look. So there we go. Now we're below the character and we can see upwards. We're getting a better view of things above us. And as we come to the top, the camera is again going to shift, going back into the original player camera. Here we are at the top, and there we go. There is our camera transition. Now, these things are all supposed to be invisible to us. We're not supposed to notice these things at all. If we notice them, we're looking at the production and we're no longer playing the game, right? So these camera moves should be not noticeable. Now, once again, we are back into our third person. We can see all the way down here. It's not a great view down, but we can see out there, and we're back into the position that we should be in as far as our camera is concerned. Watch what happens as the player shifts out onto the ledge. So our player has now moved down in the frame itself. The player hasn't moved. The camera's moved up, obviously. But within the frame itself, our player is now low within the frame, crouched down, and we get this view all around here. It's kind of this downward view. We're getting a view of the landscape, and that's the reason why we climbed this tower. We wanted to see what was up there. We wanted to see all around us. Now, as we go forward, there's going to be a hard cut. There's going to be a transition, but it's going to be a hard cut from a player-controlled camera into a game-controlled camera. So if I hit play here, we'll see it occur out on the ledge here, and bam, there was that hard cut. Now we're doing what's called a circle shot. We'll talk about this again a little bit later on. We're doing a circle shot, and typically a circle shot will maintain something within its view, so we've got a reference. In this particular circle shot, Ubisoft has decided to rotate around an odd place. It's not, I don't even know what they're rotating around. Maybe over here somewhere. I'm not really sure exactly where they're rotating. Maybe it's kind of this moving origin that they're rotating around. But it's meant to give us a view of the surrounding area and say, look at how far you made it up. It's kind of this celebration of the fact that we made it to the top of this tower and that we're getting ready to jump. So let me just scroll back a little bit here so we can see that again. So the transition from here to here is a hard cut. I don't love it. The rotation, this strange view, keeps the tower in place, relatively in the same location, but our character is out of place, which is kind of strange to me. What we're going to see here is a transition, a softer transition, where we're going to fade from the game-controlled camera into our player-controlled camera. And watch how it happens. Watch what happens here. We're slowly going to get our assets back. We're going to get our elements back. So there we've got our HUD coming back in, and now our player knows that they are in control, right? Everything has been given to this particular player, and they are now know they're back into control of the character. Now, the character is going to move out. Now, watch what happens again. We've got this view now. We have this vast view. This is what they want you to see. Oh, look at, we can see the entire city. Amazing. But watch what happens to this camera. As the player moves out onto the ledge, the camera shifts down. There we go. And we're looking straight down now. Now, again, this is supposed to be invisible to us. Take a look at this camera. Take a look at how tight the framing is, right? We don't have a whole lot of information here. We've got ourselves a long lens, so it's been reduced. The amount of information in the background's been reduced. But watch what happens when our player jumps. When the player jumps, the character jumps, the camera is going to pull back and our field of view is going to widen. So we're going to go into this shorter lens, and it's going to give us much more view of the surrounding area. And then afterwards, it's going to move upwards. Our camera's going to move upwards, and then it's going to chase the player all the way down. And it's this particular movement, that particular camera, that causes vertigo in a lot of people. So let's just see it. There we go. Pull back, wider lens, falling, chasing, and boom, we land in there with him. Let's watch that one more time. And like I said, when this first came out, it was really groundbreaking in the fact that it caused a vertigo in so many players. There we go. Pulled back and falling, land. All right. Awesome. Let's take a look at a couple more examples of a dynamic camera. When we talk about Shadow of Colossus, the horseback riding, the camera itself moves down. So normally we've got ourselves a typical third-person camera when we're playing the game. And once we get on our horse, the entire thing shifts, right? Where the entire camera shifts over so that we are following the rule of thirds. And it gives us a bigger view of the world. We're kind of down below the horse, and we get this larger view of the world. It really makes the world feel larger. In 3D Mario games, another great example. Typically at the beginning of 3D Mario games, the camera is not in its typical game camera. Instead, we have this really wide angle shot. It's well above the level, and we kind of get this view of the entire level. It acts as an establishing shot for the level, so the players themselves can orient themselves within the world that they're being presented here, the level they're being presented here. They kind of understand what's to come. They'll know exactly how far they are because they've got all this information now. And once the player has an opportunity to look over that level briefly, the camera then dynamically moves back into the position where the gameplay camera is supposed to be, and then the players can go about playing. So those are both really great examples of of a dynamic camera utilizing different theories within cinematography. So the kind of rule of thirds within the Shadow of the Colossus horseback riding and the establishing shot within 3D Mario games. All right, let's take a really quick look at Shadow of the Colossus. Okay, what we're going to see in this particular clip is the dynamic camera shifting from a player view, which as we can see right now, even just looking at this still frame, our camera is up high in third person. It's trying to catch up to the player. The player just ran from this dais, and they've come around back up these steps, and they're running towards this horse right now. That's what the character is doing, and the camera is dynamically trying to keep up with the player as the player moves. It's having a hard time, right, because it's shifting with the player. It's reacting to the player. Now, like I said, the camera is looking down on our player. It's kind of a typical third-person camera. If I hit play now, we're going to see the player. There we go. The camera shifts, and now the player's kind of in the center of the screen. The player's in the center of the screen at this point in time. And what we're going to see as the player moves into the field, there's going to be a transition as the player moves into the field, and we're going to see a drastic change. Right now, our player is located in the center of our screen. We're still kind of high looking down on the player. Let's take a look what happens here when the player transitions out. So there's going to be a transition here any moment. This is not my footage, guys. So there we go. Now, the camera has changed dynamically. It's reacted to this particular player's actions, right? The player's on the horse. The horse and the player are now following along this third lines. The character is no longer directly in the middle of the screen, right? The character and the horse are following along this third line here. So it's following the rule of thirds, and we'll talk about the rule of thirds later on when we talk about composition. Now, what this does is it opens up this area here. There's a great big vast play area here, or a view area here, that our player can see. It makes the world look bigger. Our rule of thirds line is here, and this whole space is empty, and our player looks like it's a vast open world. Even the camera, instead of being up high and looking down above the character's shoulders, we're now kind of following right around the horse's flank area here. I think this is called horse's flanks. I'm not going to say the other word, what it is. But it's right along here now. It's lower and it's kind of looking upwards. It's kind of at, it's below well below eye level. Now watch, when I hit play here, as a player moves around, the camera is going to react dynamically to the player's movements. It's going to do its best to keep that rule of thirds operational. But here we go. It's trying to react, and it's going to move back into place, and then bam, there. It slowly slides back into place. So even though the player shifted around within this area, it kind of moved all around, which was great, right? It went back into the rule of thirds, and it maintained this view of this huge area the player can run through. Like I said, that's meant to make the world feel larger, right? The camera itself has been pulled back. The player is smaller. The horse is smaller within the frame, and there's this huge world the player can explore. All right, guys, that takes us to the end of this particular video. I hope you enjoyed it. We talked about a lot of stuff. I threw a lot of information at you, and really it was just an overview of most of it. We're going to be going in depth into almost all of the stuff we talked about today. We started off with the idea of mise en scène with some terminology, idea that everything within your scene is important, that you put it there for a particular reason, that everything in your scene could be either diegetic or non-diegetic, right? If it's diegetic, that means it's meant to be part of the world. If it's non-diegetic, then it is something that's outside of the world space, but the players still see it. If it's a diegetic visual or non-diegetic visual, right? The players still see it. So again, this is going to affect them as far as the mood and the feeling. That's your job as a cinematographer for games, is to create a particular mood or feeling within your player to make sure that they become immersed within your game. That is your job. After that, we talked a little bit about the idea of dynamic game cameras and procedural cameras, and how they can change the player's view, and how they take into account things like cinematography theory in order to make sure that our player's experience is enjoyable. Now again, these shifting cameras are meant to be something that's not noticed, right? We don't want our players looking at the production of our game. We want them just simply playing our game, right? So these cameras are supposed to go unnoticed. In fact, I hope you saw by the gameplay videos that we watched that there are a ton of opportunities that occur already that maybe you weren't even aware of. Take a look at some of the games you're playing from now on. Here, I'm asking you guys to break your own immersion levels and try and examine the cameras that are in your game. See if they're shifting and if you weren't even aware of them before. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know down below with a thumbs up, and if you didn't, a thumbs down is perfectly fine. I love to hear from you. I would love to hear from you guys and your comments on how I'm doing with this particular teaching and how you guys are enjoying these particular videos. All right, guys? Thumbs up, thumbs down, comments down below, and if you haven't done so, please take a few seconds to subscribe. Have yourselves a wonderful day, everyone.